this a little bit earlier, I think at the very beginning where you had talked about everybody usually, and I've been to a lot of events, especially recently, and I've noticed that this seems to be so much the standard that people just walk up and say, they do the introduction. Hey, Shane, nice to meet you. I'm Nick. What do you do, Shane? What do you do? And the thing about that is it's leads to being like a forgettable exchange kind of, because it's such a thing that so many people say that people have their automatic responses prepared to that, their little elevator pitch or whatever. I do this. And then the person that asked, they immediately try to put you in a box of whatever they know that is,
Yep.
or what they think that is. And they say, so you say, hey, I'm into real estate wholesale. Then they would say, okay, what do I know about that? Okay, he's one of these people. And they assume they pretty much know everything about you now from that. And then either they're going to be like, well, I don't have any need for that service. So I'm going to go ahead and find somebody more interesting. Or,
Sure.
they might, they'll say their thing, I am an orthodontist. And then you categorize, okay, orthodontist. Okay, maybe the kids need braces. Maybe this might be a person, but you don't want to be put in that box, and you don't want that forgettable exchange. You want it to be not just based on, hey, this is what I do. It's such a common thing that everyone does, but I find, like, I never ask people, and in my book I say, don't ask people what they do, because it'll come out. And you had said it earlier, it comes out anyway in conversation. People will bring it up, but I don't like to lead with what do you do, because what if they don't like it? A lot of people don't like what they do, and they might want to talk about something else. So I try to talk about, what's a cool hobby? What do you like to eat? Do you have any restaurant recommendations? Just any sort of thing. Someone the other day had said to me, they said, what are you most passionate about? And then I was like, you're going to lead with that? You're going to just walk up to a stranger and ask me what I'm most passionate about? Because that could be a little, it's not necessarily personal, but I don't know if that's something that I'm willing to just get into with some stranger that I just met and then tell them my passions. And then they might just say, oh, your passions suck. And I'm like, well, I just spent 5 minutes telling you that I like sailboats and kayaks.
Almost like the ugly baby vulnerability.
Right.
Yeah.
So you want to do a little ice breaking in there. And so so I'd say not to ask, what do you do? Because you're trying to really find out about the person. So not necessarily what they do, but just like, who is this person that you're talking to? And so there's a lot of different icebreakers, and we're going to get into icebreakers, but there's a lot of different ways that you can kick it off, and they're going to tell you what they do, or they're going to tell you what they like. It's people bond over, shared interests and hobbies and things like that. Not necessarily just because I said, like, so if I'm a plastic surgeon, sure, there's certain things that, people are going to get excited about. If you're a plastic surgeon, you might as well tell, hey, I'm a plastic surgeon, because then people are going to say, I have so many questions, because everyone has questions for plastic surgeons, of course. There's sure, if you're an astronaut or something, go ahead. Yeah, sure. Fine. You can walk up, hey, I'm Nick, I'm an astronaut, and then I have some cool stories. You want to hear about aliens, or, whatever it is.
Sure.
But yeah, the what do you do thing, to me, it just seems so, when people ask me, I'm always like, oh, one of these. And then usually I'll deflect and I'll say, let me tell you what I'm working on. And so that's one thing that I'll ask people, what are you working on? What interesting projects are you working on, Shane? And then once you say what interesting projects you're working on, I'll learn about, it might not necessarily be what you do, but it's what you feel is an interesting project you're working on that you would like to share with me. And then that opens up a conversation more that you would like to have versus you just throwing out your elevator pitch and then us trying to build a conversation around that. And so once again, before we get into the actual icebreakers, I try to steer away from the what do you do, and then when people do it to me, I usually will bring up just this is what I'm working on instead of what I do, because I'm not trying to get into lumped into the box before you can actually hear about what I think is cool, is interesting, that I'd like to talk about, that I'm working on.
Yeah,
I think it gives a better profile. What would you say?
I would agree. Yeah, I mean, I would agree full-heartedly. I think it's interesting because I've mentioned our introduction a couple of years ago multiple times now, and it wasn't until I think maybe like 2 or 3 months ago that I actually found out what at the time your current career was. I had no idea. Over like 3 years or something, I had no idea what you actually did. I
Right.
only knew the interesting projects that you were working on, type of
Yeah.
thing. And that's kind of what intrigued both of us. And I also I think this is important all the way around. But who are you, type of thing. I don't want necessarily just even lump this into tell me a little bit about yourself, type of thing. Or I kind of feel like when you tell somebody about yourself, well, okay, tell me about, oh, I'm the director of marketing management at whatever PNC. Well, a little bit about yourself. Like for me, I think so I used to always start with, well, I'm a father of two kids. I'm a father of two kids, and this is what I have my kids, and I'll tell them a little bit about them, and then a little bit about some of my hobbies. And I think that's kind of what interested me is about you. You started talking about the course was your first thing.
Right.
So this is a project that I'm working on. I had no idea what anything else you were doing. So, and it was it was definitely not a forgettable interaction. Just obviously, we're still talking a couple years or whatever, a couple years later. I don't remember when that was. But here we are still talking and doing Zoom calls and calls all the time. So I would certainly agree, because how many times have you met somebody that does some type of sales in some medical device industry? You're like, okay, well, had no idea. He didn't have purple gator shoes on. He wasn't doing a cakewalk. He didn't want cookies, and he told me he was a manager of directing operations or something.
Right. Which
You know
tells me
what?
nothing really.
Which tells me nothing. Does he have a kid? I mean, does he play sports? Does he play music? I mean, what? What's interesting? And everybody's interesting in their own way.
Right.
Everybody. And it's not necessarily just a way to find out how to progress your business or to fulfill a dream you had of driving on a private or flying on a private airplane. It's just being in connection with other people and learning about them, because that's kind of what we're all here for anyways, right? It's just
Right.
like this social interaction. That's how we've become such an interesting society. So
Right. And there's several people that you made me think of that I've known for years that I do not know what it is, that whatever, if they have a title of some sort, I have no idea what it is. And so it doesn't always come up in conversation because, there's people I've spent time, hung out with them, met their families, and like, I have no idea, but apparently it wasn't important to the relationship because, and maybe if I just said, what do you do? It might have taken the whole relationship in a whole different way. Just like when you met me the first time, if I would have just put myself in that little box, it would have changed the whole thing. When I said, hey, this is what I'm working on, then that was the actual interesting thing that you're like, oh, I would like to talk to you more about that. But if I,
yeah,
hey, I do this other thing, and then I just throw that out there, then you'd be like, okay. And then you might not have follow-up questions. Or the worst thing is when people do have, if I throw out a title and then people have questions about it, but then I don't really want to discuss that. I want to discuss my projects. I don't want to discuss this other stuff. And so then
yep,
people are having a conversation with me that I don't want to have. I want to have a conversation about, my passions and my projects. And so
sure,
when I was trying to film a documentary down in Brazil, that's when people would say, what do you do? I said, well, I'm working on trying to do a documentary down in Brazil on trying to reverse engineer becoming a local celebrity. And they're like, what? And now they have questions. And now we have an interesting conversation because that's what I was working on at the time. And, then that we're having a conversation versus, talking about chemistry or something. And then somebody has a bunch of chemistry questions, and then I'm like, I don't want to talk about this. And do they really want to talk about this, or do they think that I want to talk about it? You know, and then I'm like, I got to get away from this person, because whenever I talk to them, they're going to try to talk about chemistry, and I don't want to talk about chemistry. I want to talk about kayaking, you know, and so, but we're going to get to that.
Yep.